The disappearances no one wanted to see. The summer heat in Indianapolis had a way of swallowing sounds whole. Sirens softened before they reached the suburbs. Street chatter faded into the humidity, and quiet was something people learned to live with. But underneath that quiet, a different kind of silence was growing. It was the silence of families waiting for their sons to come home, the silence of unanswered phone calls, the silence of faces on missing posters that blended into streetlights and bus stops as though no one had ever been looking for them in the first place. By the early 1990s, that silence had begun to smother the city. Young men were vanishing, not one at a time in ways that could be explained. They were disappearing in clusters, vanishing after nights out at places where people were supposed to feel free, loved, and safe. Vanishing without fights, without breakups, without warnings, without even a hint of a goodbye. For many families, the first few days were filled with hope. Hope that their sons had gone on spontaneous trips, or that they had lost their phones, or that they were crashing at a friend's house. But days became weeks became months, and hope slowly turned into something heavier, something thick enough to drown in. The police departments that covered Indianapolis and the surrounding towns were not prepared for what was unfolding. Each case was filed separately because each man disappeared from a slightly different part of the map. Some vanished downtown, some from the suburbs. One was last seen in Lafayette. There was no single crime scene to circle on the board, no single detective to hand all the files to. Multiple counties meant multiple departments, and multiple departments meant no one was connecting anything. To make matters worse, many of the missing men were part of the gay community. At the time, detectives often assumed these men had simply left town to start over somewhere else. It was the kind of excuse that sounded reasonable enough to let everyone sleep a little easier. But it was an excuse that cost precious time and, for many families, destroyed any chance of finding answers before it was too late. By 1993, the stack of missing persons reports had become impossible to ignore. Mothers sat in police station lobbies with envelopes of photos and handwritten timelines of their sons' last known movements. Fathers who had never cried in front of anyone found themselves breaking down in conference rooms. Friends taped flyers to bar windows and street poles until their knuckles bled. Still, no one had a reason to believe these disappearances were connected. Not yet. That turning point began with a retired sheriff detective named Virgil Vandegrift. He was calm, methodical, and stubborn in a way that made him good at the job. After leaving law enforcement, he started a small private investigation firm. It was supposed to give him a quieter life, but that never happened. When the families of two missing men approached him, they were exhausted from pushing and begging the police to take their cases seriously. Their sons, Roger and Alan, had vanished under circumstances that felt too similar to be coincidence. The mothers hoped Vandegrift would look without bias, without hesitation, and without the excuses that had become so familiar. Vandegrift did more than listen. He investigated with the urgency the police had failed to show. He spread out all the missing persons files he could access and combed through every detail. Last sightings, clothing descriptions, the bars they had visited, who they had spoken to, whether they had taken ride from anyone. Patterns began to emerge like faint outlines on the fogged window. Time frames overlapped. Neighborhoods overlapped. Many victims shared physical traits. The coincidence argument weakened with every page. He founded a small unofficial task force with other investigators and community volunteers. Together they visited bars, distributed missing flyers, and interviewed patrons. People in the gay community had long felt a predator was lurking. Someone who watched from dark corners and lingered too close to vulnerable men. Someone who never stayed long enough to be remembered, but just long enough to choose. Eventually, a name surfaced, or at least an alias. Brian Smart. People described him as all but friendly, a man who seemed to drift through bars without much purpose. He claimed to be staying on a wealthy client's property outside the city. Some people had visited the estate once or twice, but no one seemed to know exactly where it was. This man, this polite stranger with the easy smile, had a story that never fully made sense. And then, in 1994, someone came forward who had survived an encounter with him. His name was Tony Harris, though that was not his real name. He requested anonymity at the time because the details of his account were terrifying enough to threaten his safety. Tony had been close with one of the missing men, Roger, and had spent weeks visiting the same bars, hoping to hear anything that might lead to him. That was how he met Brian Smart. Smart told Tony he was living temporarily at an estate that belonged to a client. He invited Tony to come back with him for a late night swim. Tony had a nagging feeling that this man might know something about Roger. Driven by grief and determination, he accepted the invitation. The ride to the property was long. The route twisted through quiet suburban streets until the houses thinned out into darkness. Tony could not see much, but when the car rolled to a stop, he recognized the outline of a large estate surrounded by trees and silence. Inside, the atmosphere was surreal. Smart led him to an indoor pool area that looked like a movie set from a dream someone probably should not be having. Mannequins stood around the water as if frozen mid-conversation. Their empty faces reflected the lights in unsettling waves. Tony felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. The two swam. Tony tried to play along, keeping himself alert and cautious. Smart offered him a drink. Tony discreetly poured it out and replaced it with water. Something about the man felt cold beneath the surface, as if his friendliness was a mask stretched too tightly over something violent. At some point, Smart asked Tony to engage in breath control during intimacy. Tony complied briefly, hoping to keep the situation predictable. Smart's face lit up with an excitement that sent a chill down Tony's spine. Then Smart suggested he return the favor and let Smart restrict his air. Tony declined. That was when the mood snapped. Smart grabbed a pool hose and wrapped it around Tony's throat. The force was immediate. Tony struggled, the world tilting in and out of focus. There were moments when he believed he would die. Moments when he faked passing out just to make Smart loosen his grip. For reasons Tony never fully understood, Smart eventually stopped. Maybe Tony was too strong. Maybe Smart realized his victim would be more effort than he was worth. Maybe something distracted him. Whatever the reason, Smart drove Tony back to the city as if nothing had happened. Tony wasted no time. He went to the police with a detailed description of Smart and everything that had taken place. But without a location or full name, the lead went nowhere. Months passed before Tony saw Smart again at the bar. This time he stayed calm. He followed Smart outside. He watched him get into his vehicle, and he memorized the license plate number. That number changed everything. When detectives ran the plate, it led to a man named Herb Baumeister, a married father of 3 who owned property in Hamilton County called Fox Hollow Farm. It was the first concrete link between Brian Smart and a real person, and it pulled investigators into a world far more disturbing than anything they had expected. But Baumeister refused to cooperate. He refused to allow a search. He refused to acknowledge any involvement. Without enough evidence for a search warrant, detectives were stuck. Their hope then shifted to someone who might not have realized she held the key to the entire case. Herb's wife, Julie. Detectives approached her carefully. They explained the ongoing investigation and the possibility that her husband might be connected to the disappearances. She was stunned, confused, angry. She insisted the police were wrong. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and as the months moved forward, Julie would eventually see something she could not ignore. Something so horrifying that it would shatter the family she thought she knew and unravel the truth behind the silent disappearances that had haunted Indianapolis for years. The farm that kept its secrets. Julie Baumeister had always believed her marriage was ordinary in its own complicated way. Herb could be moody, aloof, and unpredictable, but she thought those quirks made him eccentric rather than dangerous. They had built a life together over 2 decades. They had children, a comfortable home, and a small business that had once given them hope for financial stability. To Julie, he was flawed but familiar. Someone she had learned to navigate like a maze she had walked too many times to get lost in. But after the detective's unexpected visit, something in the air at Fox Hollow Farm changed. Herb had always been private about certain parts of the property. He kept rooms locked. He discouraged Julie from cleaning certain areas. He grew tense whenever she wandered too close to the wooded parts of land. She had chalked it up to his odd nature. Now those habits felt like warning signs she had ignored. Julie tried to shake the feeling. She told herself the police were mistaken. She convinced herself that Tony Harris had confused her husband with someone else. Maybe Herb simply resembled the man Tony had encountered. Maybe the detectives overstated how serious the situation was. These explanations were comforting, and she clung to them because the alternative was too horrifying to consider. But the detective's words echoed in her mind whenever Herb acted strangely. She became more observant. Little things she had dismissed over the years returned to her thoughts. Herb would stay out late without explanation. He often came home looking exhausted and on edge. He guarded his privacy fiercely. He spent long hours in the pool house without telling her why. If she asked too many questions, he responded with irritation that bordered on hostility. Their marriage had become a fragile thing held together by routine rather than love. Julie felt guilty for even entertaining the thought that her husband might be capable of violence. Yet she could not deny the unease building in her chest. Meanwhile, investigators were stuck in a holding pattern. They needed evidence to justify a warrant. Even with Tony Harris's terrifying account, they had no physical proof linking Herb to a crime. They needed something concrete on Fox Hollow Farm, something that could stand up in court, something that a judge could not ignore. But Herb was too careful. He refused every request to search the property. He shut down conversations. He became defensive and erratic. He threatened legal action. His behavior grew so hostile that investigators knew they were hitting a nerve. But without Julie's cooperation, their hands remained tied. Pressure grew with every passing month because the list of missing men was not shrinking. Families were desperate for closure. Community members feared the predator was still active, and investigators knew time was slipping away. Serial offenders did not simply stop. They escalated. They grew bolder. They took greater risks. The fear was that another young man would vanish before they could intervene. Julie's life reached a breaking point in early 1996. Tensions in her marriage grew unbearable. Herb's business was failing. Their finances were in chaos. His erratic behaviors intensified. He stopped sleeping regularly. He snapped at the children for minor things. He became paranoid, pacing through the house at night as if expecting someone to come for him. One evening, Julie decided she could no longer keep denying the truth. She needed to look for answers on her own. The moment that changed everything began in the most mundane way. The children wanted to play outside, and she walked with them near a wooded area at the edge of the property. This was a place Herb always discouraged them from exploring. He claimed it was too easy to get lost and that the ground was uneven. Julie never questioned it too deeply, but on that day, she allowed herself to wander farther than usual. As she moved through the trees, she noticed a shape near the ground. Something pale, something that did not look like a stone or branch. She stepped closer. The soil had eroded from recent weather, revealing a curve of something she could not immediately identify. She bent down. In that moment, everything stopped. What she saw was unmistakable. It was human bone. Her stomach collapsed inward, and the world shifted around her. She staggered backward, struggling to breathe. Her mind raced through 1,000 explanations. Maybe the previous owners had buried animals. Maybe it was something old and unrelated to her. Maybe she was wrong. But no amount of rationalizing could make bones look like anything other than bones. Julie did not confront her husband. She was too frightened and too uncertain. Instead, she reached out to her attorney and quietly began considering separation. Her marriage was already deteriorating, but now it felt terrifying. For a while, she tried to convince herself that the bone had an innocent origin. She buried the thought, hoped she had misunderstood, and avoided returning to that part of the property. But the image would not leave her mind. It stayed with her every night as she lay awake, thinking about Herb's erratic behavior, thinking about the detective's warning, thinking about the missing men whose families were still searching for answers. By June of 1996, Julie filed for divorce, citing Herb's instability and unpredictable temper. This legal separation changed everything. She no longer felt obligated to protect him from scrutiny. She no longer felt guilty for questioning him. She finally felt free to help investigators. She called the detectives and told them she was ready to talk. When they met, Julie told them about the bone she had seen on the property. She described the area behind the house where the ground looked disturbed. She explained Herb's refusal to let her or the children explore that part of land. She also told them about his sudden spiraling behavior, his paranoia, and moments where he seemed terrified of someone discovering something he had hidden. It was a breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. Julie granted them permission to search the property that she partially owned. Herb no longer had the authority to stop them. With her consent, detectives finally had the legal ability to set foot on Fox Hollow Farm. They arrived quietly on a warm June afternoon, expecting to find evidence of possible wrongdoing. What they uncovered instead was a mass grave. The investigators began by examining the area Julie had described. Within minutes, they found bones. Not one, not two, dozens. Some were partially buried. Some were scattered across the soil. Some were charred. Many were fragments so small that detectives had to sift through the dirt as if searching for grains of rice. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying the scene became. They uncovered skull fragments, teeth, vertebrae, ribs, hands, feet, thousands of pieces that belonged to multiple individuals. The bones were in various stages of decay, indicating the remains had accumulated over several years. The investigators were stunned. They had expected to find something. They had not expected to find an entire dumping ground. The news spread rapidly through law enforcement channels. A task force was formed instantly. Anthropologists and forensic specialists were called in. The property became an active excavation site. By nightfall, the number of bones was so overwhelming that the team realized they were not dealing with a few victims. They were dealing with something far worse. And while the team worked, word of the discovery reached the man responsible. Herb Baumeister had fled the house. He told Julie he needed time to clear his head and left without giving a destination. At first, she believed it was part of their routine marital conflict. But when she returned to the house and found it eerily quiet, she felt an instinctive fear settle in her chest. Herb never came back. As the search continued, the scale of the horrors at Fox Hollow Farm became undeniable. The fragments suggested at least 11 victims and potentially more. Many remains were too damaged to identify individually. Investigators knew they needed to locate Herb before he disappeared completely. But Baumeister had already crossed the state line. He was driving alone, leaving behind a life he had carefully constructed in the crimes he had kept buried for years. Every mile he traveled brought him farther from the truth, slowly rising to the surface of Fox Hollow Farm. The man once known as Brian Smart had vanished again, but this time he was not hunting a victim. He was running from the reckoning waiting for him back home. And as he fled, the families of the missing men waited for one thing: justice. The aftermath and the unfinished story. By the summer of 1996, law enforcement was in full crisis mode. Fox Hollow Farm had become a crime scene unlike any other in Indiana's history. The sheer quantity of human remains overwhelmed even seasoned investigators. Every piece of bone, every fragment, and every personal item recovered told the story of lives stolen, families shattered, and a killer who had evaded detection for years. Herb Baumeister's disappearance only intensified the urgency. Authorities issued multi-state alerts, hoping to track him down before he could cross international borders. Helicopters combed rural areas. Patrol cars set up roadblocks. And yet, for several days, he remained unaccounted for. Each passing hour heightened the tension for investigators and families alike. Then came the grim discovery in Ontario, Canada. A parked car by Lake Huron contained the lifeless body of Herb Baumeister. He had taken his own life, ending the possibility of a trial, and leaving the families of his victims without answers in court. The note he left behind focused entirely on himself, his failed marriage, and his business woes. He did not confess to any of the murders. He did not acknowledge the pain he had caused. His silence became the final act in a twisted narrative, leaving investigators and families frustrated and heartbroken. With Baumeister gone, attention shifted fully to the recovery and identification of his victims. Teams of anthropologists, forensic specialists, and DNA analysts worked tirelessly to make sense of the chaos at Fox Hollow. Burned, fragmented, and intermingled bones made identification painstakingly slow. Each match required patience, skill, and the cooperation of family members for DNA comparisons. By 1999, several victims had been identified, providing some closure, though grief remained unhealed. Families, who had lived in uncertainty for years, finally received confirmation of their loved ones' fates. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends could at least hold funerals and grieve properly. The identification process continued into the 2000s, aided by technological advancements in DNA testing. By the early 2020s, investigators employed modern forensic genetic genealogy, uncovering identities of victims who had remained nameless for decades. Alan Livingston and several others were finally returned to their families. Each identification was a victory for justice, even if it came decades too late. The impact of Herb Baumeister's crimes went far beyond families directly affected. The community of Indianapolis, once quiet and unsuspecting, learned that horror could be hidden behind a familiar facade. Fox Hollow Farm, a property that seemed ordinary from the road, became a haunting symbol of what can happen when darkness is allowed to hide in plain sight. Investigators and forensic specialists also reflected on the lessons learned. Vigilance, community cooperation, and persistence were key to uncovering the truth. Tony Harris's courage in coming forward, the private investigator's determination, and Julie Baumeister's eventual cooperation all demonstrated the critical role individuals can play in solving crimes. Their actions proved that even when law enforcement faces bureaucratic or legal obstacles, determined people can make a difference. Yet the case remains open. Not all victims have been identified, and questions linger about the full scope of Baumeister's crimes. Modern investigators continue to search the property when new tips arise or when forensic technology allows for more precise analysis. Decades after the first disappearances, the story of Fox Hollow Farm reminds us that justice is sometimes a long and difficult road, but every step forward honors a memory of those lost. Herb Baumeister's death closed a chapter on the manhunt, but did not close the book on the impact of his crimes. Communities, law enforcement, and families continue to work together, ensuring that the victims are remembered and that lessons from this case inform the future. Every recovered bone, every identification, and every shared story keeps the memory of the victims alive. Fox Hollow Farm remains a chilling example of a predator living among the unsuspecting. It is a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and community, of never ignoring suspicious behavior, and of listening to survivors who bravely come forward. Most importantly, it stands as a testament to the human spirit's resilience in the face of unimaginable evil. As we reflect on this story, remember the victims. Remember the bravery of those who refuse to let them be forgotten. And remember that justice can take time, but it is never truly out of reach.